The 1930s saw the entrance of the swing era. I can think of no better way to introduce this change in jazz than to point you to the 1959 slapstick comedy Some Like It Hot, featuring Marilyn Monroe, Tony Curtis, and Jack Lemmon. There are a couple of clips from Some Like It Hot on your YouTube playlist. The film starts in a speakeasy that is run by the Chicago mob. This is the sort of place that you would have found in the late 20s and early 30s. As the police raid the mob speakeasy, Curtis and Lemmon, who are band members, escape with their saxophone and double bass. They no longer have a job. The only work that they can find is with an all-girl jazz band. And just a side note, we'll see in a later video there were many all-girl jazz bands during the 30s and 40s. So Curtis and Lemmon dress up as women and in their disguises head to Florida to play a gig at a luxury hotel with their new girlfriends. Now, even if you don't normally like black and white film, you should really try to watch this one. For the present purposes, however, what I want you to do is compare and contrast the music that you hear in the speakeasy with the music that the band plays at the Florida resort. Backing up Sugar, played by Marilyn Monroe, as she sings, I Want to Be Loved by You, Just You. The music at the speakeasy at the beginning of the film, the first YouTube clip, is classical hot jazz from the 1920s. The music played by the all-girl band in Florida is the slower swing style that would dominate the 1930s and the 1940s. Swing music as a style of jazz flourished roughly between 1934 and 1945, from the end of the Great Depression to the end of World War II. It features swung eighth notes, slower tempos, and arrangements of popular tunes, all played by big band ensembles. On your screen you see one of the most popular of the groups, the Glenn Miller Band, in a circa 1939 photo. These big bands played a combination of written out and improvised music. As you might imagine, it is much easier for a small ensemble of 5 to 7 players than for a big band of 15 to 25 players to improvise. Instead, these big bands were arranged into sections: the reeds, the horns, and the rhythm section. The diagram on the screen lays out this division. Within a section, there was generally 1 or 2 players who were called upon to improvise, while the rest of the band played accompanimental figures. Occasionally, composers and arrangers would write out solos for an entire section to play in unison. These big bands played at large clubs and dance halls throughout the United States. In New York City, there were 3 particularly important venues for swing music. One was the Cotton Club, the club which launched the careers of black band leaders Fletcher Henderson and Duke Ellington, while only admitting audience members who were white. The shows put on at the Cotton Club reinforced many racist images, unfortunately. The performers were often dressed up as savages or as darkies, and I use that term, of course, in quotes. Such racist costuming and sets, fortunately, was harder to convey via the airwaves, and so the radio broadcasts of the Cotton Club shows contributed to the popularization of jazz among a much wider audience. The Roseland Ballroom, similarly, allowed only whites on its dance floors, although its house bands were often African American. The Savoy Ballroom in Harlem has a completely different story. Its interior decor modeled after the Roseland, it was a place where blacks and whites danced together from 1926 to 1959. Fletcher Henderson's orchestra got its start at the Cotton Club and then played at a great variety of venues. Pianist Henderson worked with many of the greats in jazz, including those shown in the photo. Look for the saxophone legend Coleman, as in Coleman Hawkins, Louis Armstrong, and then to the far right you can see Don Redman. Don Redman was a saxophonist, but today he's best known for his jazz compositions and arrangements. In Chicago, the sounds of the Paul Whiteman Orchestra and the Earl Hines Orchestra filled the dance halls and radio channels. The dance music they and Fletcher Henderson's band played did not always incorporate much improvisation, and some would not call it jazz. Note also that there were string instruments in Whiteman's orchestra, instruments that have been a part of jazz history but haven't played the same pivotal role that other instruments such as the trumpet or the saxophone have played. The swing music of Whiteman and Hines was very popular, and it did use the syncopation, varied timbres, and forms associated with jazz. Born in the Northeast, pianist Count Basie ended up in Kansas City with the Benny Moten Band. The Moten Band played with the classic Kansas City sound. This sound featured a lot of blues, the repetition of short riffs, and the use of memorization. The riffs were often played by the brass section, sometimes amounting to what has been called blasts of brass. Head arrangements involved memorization. They refer to unscored collaborative arrangements. So instead of playing from a detailed musical score with detailed musical notation that would prescribe every note that was to be played, head arrangements involved the members of the group working out and then memorizing the tune they were playing and then their improvisations. Listen for these things as you listen to 1 O'Clock Jump, both on your playlist and in your listening guide. The Count Basie Band toured widely throughout the entire 20th century. In fact, they are still touring today, naturally with slightly different personnel. Radio was the most important force that made swing music America's popular music of the 1930s. Benny Goodman's orchestra, for example, got its start on a 3-hour Saturday evening radio show called Let's Dance. The show piped swing music into households across the United States, so that even those who did not live in a large urban center with a dance hall could listen and dance at home. Film was another significant means through which American audiences were exposed to jazz. Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, and others appeared in numerous short and feature-length films in the 1930s and 1940s. Clarinetist and bandleader Benny Goodman was born in 1909 in a very poor white neighborhood of Chicago. His first exposure to music was at his local synagogue. He then picked up the clarinet and was soon playing professionally. Arriving in New York City, he quickly established himself as the king of swing, and in 1934 his band was chosen to provide music for the radio show Let's Dance. In May of 1935, the band headed across the country on tour, expecting a lot of success because the radio show had been quite successful. However, the driving swing that they had played on the radio was poorly received all the way across the country. Arriving at the Palomar Ballroom in Los Angeles in August, they were almost completely broke for money, and they started playing the slower and quieter music that they had been playing for the audiences on their tour, music that their audiences seemed to prefer over the driving style of Let's Dance. The audience at the Palomar, however, was not responsive to this slower and quieter music. And so finally the band said, "What the heck?" and they went back to the lively Fletcher Henderson tunes that they had been doing for the radio show. Upon doing that, the crowd apparently went crazy with excitement, and the jitterbug became the newest dance craze. Because of the significance of this reception in Los Angeles at the Palomar, it's sometimes seen as marking the beginning of the swing era. Benny Goodman was known for his tight ensembles, meaning that his bands were very carefully rehearsed and played very precisely. Goodman himself was known as a bit of a drill sergeant. He demanded excellence of everyone he worked with. He is also known for having worked closely with a large number of African American musicians, and this was unusual for the time. Although racial segregation would not allow for mixed big bands, not even on the radio, Goodman formed several small ensembles in the late 1930s in which black and white musicians made music together. These trios and quartets toured in areas friendlier to blacks and whites mixing, and they avoided locales where Jim Crow laws would have led to their arrest. One of Goodman's signature tunes was Sing, Sing, Sing. Unlike most arrangements of the time, which were approximately 3 minutes in length so that they could fit on one side of a phonograph record, Goodman's performances of this piece typically range from 8 to 10 minutes or 12 minutes long. One of its most famous versions is the recording from a 1938 Goodman concert in New York's Carnegie Hall. This concert is famous because it was one of the first times that popular music, like Goodman's, was allowed in one of the most prestigious spaces of art or classical music. Make sure that you study it with the listening guide on the course website. Stomping at the Savoy was another tune for which Goodman's band was famous. It actually had been written for Chick Webb's band, which was the house band at the Savoy Ballroom by this time. Chick Webb was an electrifying drummer. A victim of spinal tuberculosis as a child, he was short in stature, but he more than made up for it in his music. He would invite other bands to the Savoy for dance band competition. In the famous challenge of 1937, his band was said to get the better of Benny Goodman's band. Listen to their versions of Stomping at the Savoy on your YouTube playlist. How do they differ? Then proceed to the next video about Duke Ellington and other jazz pianists of the 1930s and 40s.